The following is a project of our nonprofit newsroom. Support Midcoast Morning and local community-centered journalism today by signing up to be a monthly sustaining donor at chwy.ca/donate. It doesn't take much money to support local news.
Hello and welcome to Midcoast Morning. I'm Joe Pugh. The Islands Trust is a special form of government serving Gulf Islands in the Salish Sea, including Gabriola, Galliano, Salt Spring, and Denman and Hornby. It was created by provincial legislation in 1974. The Trust's mandate, as written in legislation, is to preserve and protect the Trust area and its unique amenities and environment for the benefit of residents of the Trust area and of the province generally, in cooperation with municipalities, regional districts, improvement districts, other persons and organizations, and the Government of British Columbia. Islands from across the Trust area elect trustees every 4 years during local elections. Multiple Gulf Islands advocacy groups have raised concerns about a statement Trust Council made about its interpretation of the Trust's mandate. Following an in-camera meeting held in September, closed to the public, Trust Council released a document that said past governance reviews had identified deep division amongst both trustees and constituents on the meaning and implementation of the Trust's Preserve and Protect mandate. The document said that Trust Council's view is that the phrase unique amenities referred to in its mandate is broad-ranging, and that such amenities may include issues such as, but not limited to, housing, livelihoods, infrastructure, and tourism. At an Islands Trust meeting held this week in Nanaimo, Salt Spring Island resident Ian Peace of the group Gulf Islands Alliance raised concerns during a delegation.
Had Trust Council debated the meaning and implementation of the object in public, then their decisions about how housing is a unique amenity and that communities must be preserved and protected would carry more weight. In other words, if trustees believe they should more or less reverse the meaning of the preserve and protect object, then the motion, their debate, and who voted for what should be on the record. This requirement for transparency aligns with trust principles. Quote, a guiding principle of the Islands Trust is that open, consultative public participation is vital to effective decision-making for the trust area. Unquote. In the meantime, existing documents describe what a unique amenity is with relative clarity. For example, the 1986 Government of BC and Islands Trust Council agreed on 12 examples of what unique amenities and environment are. Notably, previous trustees consider unique amenities and environment together. Now, here's a few examples that illustrate the meaning. Almost a continuous tree cover and large undeveloped areas, solitude, scenic beauty, and a clean environment, compact marine-oriented settlements, a unique water supply situation, i.e. small watersheds, shallow soils, and heavy reliance on groundwater sources. Islands Trust Council and the BC government further agreed, defining the unique amenities and environment of the Trust area is the focus of the Trust's program.
Following his delegation, Peace spoke with CHLY reporter Mick Sweetman.
This publication came out that again claimed consensus, but looking carefully at the way the publication was presented indicates that the only thing that the Trust Council reached consensus upon was the actual trust object. So that's what I came here today to commend them on, their unanimous support of the trust object. And then what followed on that same document was a few paragraphs of diluted interpretations of what the object might mean. And the ones that stuck out for me were housing is a unique amenity and that communities must be preserved and protected.
And what is your concerns with those two things?
Well, I don't believe that there's anything unique about housing, and I understand where they're coming from. Elected trustees are concerned about the lack of affordable housing and other social issues in the Gulf Islands. However, that's not the jurisdiction of Trust Council, which is land use decisions, and they're supposed to be guided by one thing only, and that is the mandate to preserve and protect. So these other considerations, like what are services that municipalities might provide, whether it's employment and other services, garbage collection, all that kind of stuff, those are not supposed to be within the jurisdiction of the Islands Trust, that they're a different form of governance, and they're focused on one thing, which is preserve and protect the natural environment.
And are you afraid that the land use will change? Like do you have specific concerns?
In general, it's been difficult for trustees to implement the object because, in my view, it's just my view, that nature doesn't kick the door in and demand to be heard at Trust Council meetings. But there are plenty of developers and other interests that do compel their issues be addressed. And there's a history of various projects that people think are not preserving and protecting the natural environment and the unique amenities of the island get approved anyway. And so it takes political will to keep returning to the preserve and protect mandate in the face of individual zoning decisions.
And I think one of your concerns, and maybe not just your organization's concern, but one that's kind of been repeated a couple of times by people who have written to the council, is that this was done in an in-camera session. Can you speak a bit about what your concerns are with that?
Well, they can do whatever they want in camera, I guess. But to expect us to accept what they're doing in camera goes against the issue of open governance and transparency. If there should have been a motion, maybe there was a motion. What would the motion be, and what was the debate like, and who spoke for what, and how did the vote go? Those are the elements that the public should be able to take a look at. And, the folks in charge of the meeting had the authority to declare whether it was in camera or not in camera. So they could have heard the legal opinion, and they could have said, okay, that's it. Now we're back in the public eye, and we'll have a debate, and has anybody got a motion? Whatever, stuff like that. So in the outcome, what happened was that I guess it was left to some trust staffers to divine what was the meaning of a whole bunch of dialogue that was in camera. So what we've got as supposedly the outcome of this document is their new scope and meaning of Section 3 is what did staff think of a whole long series of different comments made by a bunch of unnamed people who must have been trustees probably, but it just doesn't add up to, it's not sufficient. It's not what we expect, that this major core element of the Islands Trust governance system would be interpreted by staffers divining kind of a stream of consciousness level of dialogue amongst a bunch of people for who knows how long. Was it a couple hours? I don't know, but it's too tough for staff to figure out what they really meant.
Ian Peace of Gulf Islands Alliance, speaking with CHLY reporter Mick Sweetman.
Midcoast Morning is made possible by the Community Radio Fund of Canada's Radio Meters program and listeners like you. Support Midcoast Morning and CHLY's nonprofit newsroom today by becoming a sustaining donor at chly.ca/donate. Local news can't survive without your support. Another way to help us out is to share this show with your friends and tell them why they should support us. Finally, if you're listening to the podcast edition of Midcoast Morning, go and give us a positive review on Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast feed you use. It helps people find us.
We're focusing on the mandate of the Islands Trust on today's program. The trust is a special form of government created in the 1970s to preserve and protect the environment and unique amenities of the Gulf Islands. Multiple groups have raised concern after the trust released a document following an in-camera meeting in September. The document said that Trust Council's view is that the phrase unique amenities referred to in its mandate is broad-ranging, and that such amenities may include issues such as, but not limited to, housing, livelihoods, infrastructure, and tourism. The group Friends of the Gulf Islands raised concerns that this could undermine the Trust's mandate to protect the environment. A written delegation from the group was included in the agenda for this week's meeting of the Islands Trust that took place in Nanaimo. I spoke with Steve Wright of Friends of the Gulf Islands, who himself is a former trustee for South Pender Island. What exactly are your concerns with the direction the Islands Trust is taking?
Well, maybe what people might not know about the Islands Trust is that it is not a local government. It's continued in statute as a trust, which means that you and all your listeners have a stake in the Islands Trust because all residents of BC are the beneficiaries of that trust. And as such, Friends of the Gulf Islands believe the trustees are failing in a fiduciary duty to preserve and protect those unique amenities in the environment on behalf of all residents. And equally important, whether people understand this or not, is that much of the trust area is unceded territory of several First Nations, and they're not even at the table. So the focus of Trust Council has, over the past number of years, been paying more attention to the human needs of their communities, which it makes sense in any other form of local government. But we believe that they are doing so at the expense of First Nations, the environment, ecosystems, natural resources, and the rural character of these islands. And all of these are being impacted by increased development and recently by climate change.
And so your concern, a lot of it stems specifically from in September of last year, the trust kind of put out this position saying that they were going to interpret unique amenities in a number of different ways. Can you explain maybe your position on that?
Yeah, well, that recent decision by Trust Council to redefine those words, unique amenities, I think to include but not limited to housing, infrastructure, transportation, tourism, etc., is almost farcical. To begin with, they're not unique to the trust area. Secondly, those matters are under the jurisdiction of those regional districts and the province. So outside of zoning appropriate areas, which is the only authority that the Islands Trust has, is to regulate through land use. LTCs, or local trust committees, they can do all that without amending the mandate. The trust is incapable of creating any infrastructure, cannot hold money, cannot hold land. Thirdly, if the province believed in 1974, when the Trust Act was proclaimed, that these things were unique amenities requiring preserving and protecting, then why not blanket the entire province with a mandate? Because aren't all small communities worthy of the same consideration? And we're also concerned that because this decision was made secretly behind closed doors, which is against community charter, refusing to record the votes and ignoring any questions about the impropriety of this process fails the smell test of good governance, in our opinion.
So on that front, it's been said from a number of sources that the session was held in camera specifically because they were seeking legal advice, and that's one of the reasons to hold an in-camera meeting. What's your reaction to that?
Well, the community charter allows governments to hold closed meetings to discuss issues such as personnel matters because of privacy, and also to discuss legal opinions. But outside of those two issues, they are not supposed to open debate and not carry on a vote outside of a public meeting. The public is entitled to listen and to hear arguments made by their elected representatives. they're also allowed to see who voted which way. And that is what has been avoided in this particular issue.
So you feel like the idea that this was a legal argument being made of, are we legally allowed to come out with this interpretation of unique amenities, isn't a strong enough justification for the meeting to be held in camera?
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't deny the fact that they may have the authority to make that decision to reinterpret the mandate. I'm just saying I don't believe that they have the right to do so in private. And I think there's a procedural fairness question here that perhaps may have to get answered by the Ombudsman. Is
this something you're considering taking to the Ombudsperson in BC?
Well, yes, we have sent 3 or 4 letters to the Islands Trust asking specific questions about that process, which they have so far refused to answer. And so if we don't get an answer, I suppose then a letter could most likely go to the Ombudsman to get his advice on the matter.
And going back to maybe the original documentation where the phrase unique amenities is written in alongside, unique amenities and environment, what is your interpretation of what you think unique amenities means in that context, given that environment is already explicitly stated as another thing?
Well, unique amenities, it's an interesting word because I think amenities first came into common usage when the Municipal Act changed legislation because they didn't want municipalities to sell zoning. And so what they came up with was amenity zoning, where they could ask a developer in exchange for some zoning if they could provide some community amenities like a swimming pool, et cetera. And originally, amenities meant a pleasurable sense of being in nature. And in 1986, the municipal government, municipal affairs, in cooperation with the Islands Trust, came up with an idea of how to define that. And in that, it talks about continued forest cover. It talks about rural character. It talks about the beauty and aesthetics of nature. It doesn't talk about infrastructure. It doesn't talk about buildings. It doesn't talk about roadways. And so we believe that 1986 definition of unique amenities should be withheld.
Why do you think this change or this interpretation of the phrase has been made?
Well, I think it's been made, and why we consider it important is because instead of being a policy-driven organization, the Trust has increasingly become a politically driven organization. And as history shows, when politics unfortunately become embroiled with the environment, then the environment generally comes in second. We're also concerned that because Council is currently undertaking a review of the Trust Policy Statement, which is the fundamental document of the Islands Trust, armed with this new definition, that important environmental policies might be compromised or even excluded in favor of more development. And to make matters worse, no studies have yet to be undertaken to establish whether these islands can sustain additional density. Over the years, more wells have dried up. We've experienced more salt intrusion in wells, making them unusable. Any responsible planning authority, you would think, should establish that data first before allowing more development and density, but not so in the Gulf Islands, I'm afraid.
Do you feel that there's a way to address maybe demographic issues and lack of housing on the Gulf Islands that doesn't involve some kind of environmental compromise?
Well, sure. I mean, the Islands Trust was not created to halt development. On the contrary, its sole responsibility is to regulate development under the guidelines of the Trust Policy Statement. And that statement of policies is meant to achieve Section 3, the object and mandate of the Islands Trust Act. Those policies have to be reflected in each of the community's official community plan, and those policies are enforced through the land use regulations, and in many cases that's not happening. So it's not a question of halting development, or it's a question of ensuring that development takes place in a manner which it does not adversely impact the environment or the natural resources. So, for instance, if we're going to have more housing, we need to find an area on those islands that can sustain that. But, for instance, we don't have a water system, so I think Salt Spring may be the only island that does have a public water system. But on most of the small islands, we rely on groundwater, and that groundwater has been markedly diminishing over the last years due to climate change. Last year we were extremely dry, and so more wells are, because they're drying up. If more development takes place in certain areas, the adjacent property owners are very concerned that their water supply may be lost. And I don't have to tell you what your property will be worth if you don't have water. I mean, I think one of the things we heard was Gabriel Island had over 9 million liters of water shipped by truck over to keep houses and commercial enterprises going a couple of years ago. And that is only going to increase.
And have you seen maybe what you're describing as the fears you have about this? Have you seen those manifested in any other way beyond maybe this interpretation of the word amenities?
Well, there's certainly more. I think since COVID, all the islands have seen much higher population levels, and that's because more people have decided that they're leaving larger cities and they can work remotely from home. It's changed the whole dynamics of how people go to work. So what is happening is we are getting more people wanting to live to the islands. Unfortunately, we're also having a lot more people with a lot more money coming to the islands. And that has caused a lot of the smaller buildings, homes, that were available for rent to local residents have been bought up, remodeled or torn down and rebuilt, and no longer available in the rental market. So there is a real shortage of housing here, not just for local residents, but also for other people wanting to come here to work. So there is I don't question that the need is there. It's just a question that I think if we're going to supply more housing, then we're going to have to find appropriate areas in which to do it, and understand that perhaps before we start that process, we need to get some idea of what the carrying capacity of these islands are. Because if we don't, then, of course, that may result in everybody losing.
And do you feel like the current governance structure set up for the Gulf Islands gives them the tools to deal with something like you just described?
Well, not exactly. I mean, I think there are some shortages in the authorities given to the Islands Trust. There are certain things that they could work with better. But frankly, I think the majority of the stuff that the trust requires, they already have. They're simply not employing them. I think that if trustees took that took the policies within the trust policy statement and put those as they were intended into their OCPs, and then made the regulations that reflected those policies, I think that likely we would be a lot closer to achieving the mandate than we are now. The problem is politics gets involved. They get discouraged from doing that because people fear that it may impact their private property rights, which actually do not exist in Canada, or that it interferes with their personal interests. And I think that is the biggest problem that we're going to face in the near future, is this populist type of political philosophy where people believe that the people that live in a particular area have the right to develop those policies. In normal situations, that may be true, but it's not necessarily true in the trust area when you have a provincial legislation that establishes a mandate. And it's up to the local people to either accept that mandate, and if they're not happy with it, well, then they have to make a decision how they want to respond to it.
In a couple of places, a couple of columns I've read on this, I've almost read maybe the opposite, the concerns about developing or concerns about increased development on the Gulf Islands could amount to a form of NIMBYism. How do you react to those?
Yeah, well, that's always a handy excuse because it always depends on where you live and where the development's going to take place. I personally have not really met anybody that is against development. I've talked to many people who do not support inappropriate development. So I think if one looks around the island and appreciates the character of those islands in which they are moving to and have some respect and compassion for that, then I don't think there's been any argument, and people are been very welcome to come here. I think where a lot of people get discouraged about is that when people come here from an urban area and then expect urban services or have urban expectations of what they would like to do, more access, more frequent access, more services, more commercial enterprises, and that is at odds with our rural community and our rural character.
Steve Wright is a former trustee for South Pender Island and a member of the group Friends of the Gulf Islands. The chair of the Islands Trust Council told CHLY that Council didn't make any decision on the mandate, and the mandate remains unchanged. That's our story for the day. Thank you for joining me. I'm Joe Pugh, host and producer of Mid-Coast Morning. Jesse Woodward is our executive producer, and RB Frew is our technical advisor. You can sign up for CHLY's newsletter at chly.ca/subscribe for updates from our nonprofit newsroom. Our theme song is First One by local Nanaimo band Waste Management. If you have a story you'd like us to cover, email us at news@chly.ca. That's all for now. I'll talk to you on another Mid-Coast Morning.
Mid-Coast Morning would not be possible without the funding of the Community Radio Fund of Canada's Radio Meters program and listeners like you. Mid-Coast Morning is a project of CHLY's nonprofit newsroom. Support nonprofit journalism in Nanaimo and on the Salish Sea today by becoming a monthly sustaining donor at $5 or more per month. Support the program at chly.ca/donate. If you're already a supporter, record a voice memo telling others where you're listening from and why they too should support our work. After you're done, you can email it to us. Also, share the podcast with your friends. While Meta is blocking Canadian users from sharing news content on their Facebook feeds, you can still share our podcast directly with your friends via Facebook or Instagram Messenger. Finally, this program acknowledges and gives thanks to the Nanaimo First Nation as we broadcast and podcast from their traditional territory. Thanks for listening.